All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to discuss what I call the law of happiness, right? So this is the next metaphysical law. Now, this law is going to be a little bit different because we mostly discuss this, at least our discussion will be a little bit different, right? We mostly discuss this law for the most part in the other laws that we talked about, so there's not a whole lot to discuss about the law itself. I really kind of want to tie this law into kind of what we see in the world today, right? So that's pretty much mostly what we're going to talk about in the video. And we're going to kind of use this law to talk about something, I might have mentioned it before, we're going to talk about this concept of metaphysical sociology, right? So that's kind of a new term. I think I mentioned the other video. I think I edited, I re-recorded the video and then didn't mention it. So, but yeah, that's an interesting term. So you could think of this as kind of being a kind of the main idea and kind of, like I said, what you might call metaphysical sociology, and that's basically just looking at the nature of society, right, which is what sociology studies, but looking at it from a metaphysical perspective as it relates to the law of manifestation. Right, so that's kind of how we're going to approach this video. Now, I could have covered so many other topics for this video, but it would just been too long, and like I said, I want to keep these videos a little shorter. Right, so I just cover a few topics. I'll cover those toward the end of the video. Right, so to get into it, to go over this first point, it says that true happiness cannot be manifested without direction from God. Right, so like I said, that's mostly kind of a consequence of everything we already discussed. But yeah, that's an important metaphysical law to recognize. Right, in other words, when it comes to the law of manifestation and manifesting a particular reality, right, and in thinking about the conditions of that reality, right, you cannot get out of all the realities in the possibility verse, right, in your future, where the reality where you're the most happy, right, where you have true happiness, right, and I'll explain kind of what I mean by that in a moment, but in the reality where you have true happiness, you cannot get to that reality, right, without direction from the Holy Spirit, right? You cannot get to it on your own. Every other reality you're going to be less happy, right? And so that's pretty much the law, right? And so what we're going to look at is the consequence of ignoring this law, right? So, or trying to find happiness some other way, which is what we pretty much do in society. So to go to this next point, I want to now talk about what happiness really is, right? Because happiness means different things to different people, right? So we have the construct or the terminology of the subconscious and all the things we basically spoke about regarding the subconscious in book 1 and throughout this book 2, right? So from everything that we've set up here, you might associate the word happiness with a particular subconscious frequency. Right, some people might associate with the frequency of joy, right? Some people might associate with the frequency of love, right, or unconditional love, and so on and so forth, right? But so people might define it differently, but overall, I think happiness generally is a very broad term, right? It's not. I wouldn't exactly describe it as a frequency, right? I might have done that sometimes throughout the whole curriculum, but generally, I was just kind of doing that to kind of make things a little easier in terms of my discussion. But generally, I like to think of happiness as a more general state, right, of contentness, right? A general state of being content with reality, right? It's a very generalized state. And so what does it mean to have true happiness then, right? Like I said, people define it different ways. You could be happy in one way and maybe not happy in another way, right? So, but what does it mean to be truly happy? Well, I like to think of it in this way, right? So to go over this next point, it says happiness is a function of the void, right? So what is the void? Well, the void is that feeling of emptiness, right? That feeling of emptiness you get when you move away from God or when you have a lower amount of spiritual energy, right? So when your spiritual energy drops, you just feel a sense of emptiness, right? That's the best way that I can describe it. A lot of people pretty much describe it in a very similar way, right? It's just a feeling of emptiness, a feeling of meaninglessness, right? It's like there's a feeling of nothingness in your heart, right? And so that's the void. And, you know, when you live in sin and you don't focus on God, you don't have a relationship with God, that feeling of the void is just kind of there. If you engage in enough moral behaviors and things like that, maybe it increases a little bit, but it never really goes that far, right? Until you have a real relationship with God, and particularly Jesus Christ, right? But like I said, if you live in sin and you live in darkness, the void increases and you feel more empty or more unhappy, right? And as you draw nearer to Jesus, you start to feel more and more happy. And then when you have a strong relationship with Jesus Christ, the void is basically closed, right? And I don't think it can fully close like that with anyone else, right? So you have to have a relationship with Jesus to fully close the void, right? And that's why all born again Christians, we kind of know we found the truth, right? Because you cannot get that feeling focusing on anyone else or any other religious figure or anything, right? I think I might have mentioned that. I already recorded it, but I think I might have mentioned that in the next video as well. But suffice it to say, that's basically how I like to think of happiness, right? Happiness in its most true form, or its most absolute form, is just the void, right? It's the void, the feeling in your heart, right? Now, most people don't think of it in these terms, right? So they think of happiness as a million other things, right? I'm unhappy if I don't have money, right? I'm unhappy if I don't bag this chick, right? Or I'm unhappy if I don't have this sort of job that I really want, right? So in other words, what people do, right, is they don't, this is the absolute sort of, you can think of it as the absolute reference frame of happiness. Now, again, most people don't think of it in these terms. What they do is they create all these imaginary sort of beliefs about happiness. And that actually, and what they do actually gets to this third point here, as what they basically create what I call happiness constructs, right? So to go over this point, it says, happiness constructs are belief systems that prescribe a blueprint for obtaining true happiness. Right? So basically, it's basically just a belief. So it's an organized sort of abstract system, right, related to your beliefs. And it's basically just a belief structure about what it means, how I obtain true happiness, right? Now, for modern society, generally, that our happiness construct, right, the happiness construct that is most generally believed throughout society is money. Right, or is related to money. We need money to buy nice things so that we're happy, right? And so that is generally what people believe. And when people have this belief construct, now remember, the absolute construct is this one, right? You're truly happy just when you find God and you manifest His will. That's it. Very simple, right, when put that way, right? But the relative construct, the one we just make up in our heads, is going to be the happiness construct, right? The happiness construct that we create, right, based on things we were told in culture and things that have been beaten into our head about happiness from a materialist society that practices material superstition, right? So we get it beaten into our heads that no, right? This makes you happy, and this makes you happy, and this makes you happy, right? So I'll go more into that later in the video, but yeah. So basically, we have happiness constructs, which are basically sort of, like I said, organized systems of belief that we focus on and we sort of almost have faith in, right? So we have faith in these constructs and we look at them as sort of a direction for how to be truly happy, right? Now, because these constructs are just illusions, right? They're not real. The real construct is this one here, right? So it has to do with the nature of God. What ends up happening when a person follows a happiness construct, so when I say happiness construct, I'm specifically meaning something that isn't real. So it's not a happiness construct where the construct is, if you follow God, you'll be happy. No, right? It's everything else except that. So when a person follows a happiness construct, of course, they can never actually find happiness because of this metaphysical law, right? So to go over this next point, it says, in following a particular HC, so that just is a short term for happiness construct, but in following a particular HC, true happiness can never be reached, of course, right? And this leads to recalculation and the continuation of the search for happiness, which I'll explain that in a moment. And this becomes an endless loop that can only be escaped by the realization that God is the only path to true happiness, right? So basically what I'm saying there, and this is kind of a strange way to put it, but this is kind of how I think about it. If you think about molecules in a solution, right, or in a liquid, right, and I think it's called Brownian motion, right? So if you look at molecules in a liquid, right, they would look like they're moving fairly randomly, right? They're moving fairly randomly, right? And their movements tend to cancel each other out in terms of momentum, right? And basically what I'm getting at is the average motion of any molecule in the local sort of space is just going to kind of do this, right? It's just going to move around and that's it. The molecule is not going to move like down there for some reason, right? It's not going to move against the sort of current or against the intermolecular forces, right? It's not going to, for some reason, move against them and try to force itself down there. No, right? It bombards a whole bunch of other molecules, right? And then it just pretty much stays in this area, right? And that's called Brownian motion. So why is that random sort of discussion important? Well, what I'm getting at is the molecule may have a reason to move here, it may have a reason to move here and here and here and here, but it's going to keep hitting some other molecule, right? And then the momentum cancels out, and then it moves some other direction, right? And ultimately, the average, right? So the average sort of momentum related to its interactions, if the average momentum, and there's thermal energy and things like that, but the average sort of energy, I should say, right, is going to cause it to just move relatively in the same place because all of its motions tend to cancel out over time, so it doesn't really go anywhere. That's kind of how it works when you're following some HC or some happiness construct for happiness. So in other words, let's say that I believe, if I, my happiness construct is I want to become a rapper, right? I believe if I become a rapper and I'm famous and I make lots of money, then I'll be happy, right? That's my happiness construct. So now I'm following this blueprint for happiness because I'm motivated to become happy, right? As we all are. And let's say that I'm doing that and I'm achieving that. Well, there will be some moments, right? Some moments during this sort of search for happiness according to this happiness construct, right? There will be some moments where maybe I do behave in a way that's aligned with the Spirit of God, right? Maybe I helped someone. Maybe I donated money, right? Or something like that. Maybe even during that time, I decided to stop drinking alcohol if I'm alcoholic, right? And during those times, I may notice some spiritual energy charge again. Again, your body charges spiritual energy. So you might notice some of your spiritual energy sort of replenished. So it replenishes when you go for a certain amount of time without sinning, right? So that void will close a little bit and I'm becoming more happy. However, the pattern of intention that I'm producing, it is not identical to the one I'm producing when I'm just manifesting God's will, right? So in that case, I'm on fire for God. I keep holding the intention that says I want to serve Jesus Christ. Holy Spirit, please direct me and how to serve you and how to serve the Father and Jesus Christ, right? When I keep having that intention and keep acting on that intention, now I'm manifesting the will of God. I'm not doing that when I'm trying to be a rapper. Now, in some instances, maybe I engage in some behaviors that I might have done in this case as well. But if my pattern of intention is not identical to it, then at some point it's going to deviate from it, right? So they might be parallel at some point, but at some point I'm going to deviate. And the moment I deviate, well, now I'm no longer getting closer to happiness. In other words, my point is that's going to keep happening every so often or enough times that either I stay relatively in the same place of happiness over time, or I lose happiness. And I might even be able to increase it to a degree, right? But I'm never going to increase it so much that I just reach true happiness, right? I never reach the same happiness that I can only get with God. At some point, right, I'm probably going to meet some maximum level of happiness, right, according to this happiness construct. And even then, that's only in as much as I chose to kind of do things aligned with the Spirit of God, right? So in other words, over time, the sort of net amount of happiness I'm going to get from this sort of happiness construct is still going to be at a relatively low level, right? But, I don't realize that, right? So I'm going to keep doing things to try to be happy, trying to make money, be famous, and be a rapper, right? And at the end of it all, right, what's going to happen, let's say I do successfully reach this state that I've been seeking, right? Let's say it's been 10 years, right? And I'm a rapper, I'm famous, and I got all this money and all these girls and everything, right? what's going to end up happening, and this always happens, right? I'm going to notice that I'm not truly happy, right? And this happens, like I said, I believe this happens to every rapper. This happens not just every rapper. This happens to everyone who follows any happiness construct that will really, based on how I define it, anybody who follows any happiness construct, right, will not find true happiness, right? Because you can, like I said, the metaphysical law says that you can only get it from God, right? And so at some point now, a person might be willing to live, right, with the amount of happiness they have obtained, but they're not truly happy because they're still going to feel the void, right? So they will always feel some degree of happiness, right? And if you, depending on what your happiness construct is, you might have obtained what you thought was going to make you happy, but the void is really, really large, right? So you are living in sin, right? You don't have a relationship with God, you're living in sin, and so you feel a much deeper void, which probably is going to be likely for a rapper, right? Someone who lives that type of lifestyle, right? At least according to the type of rap artists you hear on the radio, the Napple culture and whatever, right? And so when I do that and I realize I'm unhappy, what do? Right? How do I respond to this? In fact, actually, before I move forward, I want to just mention something that Jim Carrey said. Excuse me, I don't know if I remember the whole quote, but it basically says something to the effect of Jim Carrey basically said he wishes that everyone could get everything they ever wanted, so they could realize that none of it meant anything, right? And I know exactly what he means, right? But I think he's mostly referring to he wishes everyone could get everything they wanted in terms of materialism, like worldly treasure, right? Not spiritual treasure. Right? In other words, what he's talking about is when you get all of these things that society told you is going to make you happy, all of the money, all of the fame, the cars, you vacation to all these things or whatever, right? You're going to realize that, you know what I mean? Because none of that really had anything to do with true happiness. That's just some nonsense people created and thought, it was so special. They put all this faith in this kind of thing that humans just made up, right? And in spirit realm, that nonsense that humans created is like, it means nothing, right? It's not that big a deal in the spirit realm, even though we see it as the biggest deal in the world, right? It's like an animal that kind of sees like something very unimportant to us, has the most special thing, like a dog that sees a bone, has like something huge, right? That's kind of how we are with like money and fame and all that. In the spirit realm, they know that all that stuff is nonsense, right? It doesn't really have any value, right? We give it value, and that's why it seems like it has value. We don't have the ability to give anything any real value, right? So I just wanted to mention that, right? And so basically going back to this, what's going to happen, right, if I become a rapper and a millionaire and whatnot, and I realize that I still feel that feeling of the void, and I want true happiness, right? Because even if I can get the void to close somewhat, I want to be truly happy, right? And I'm not happy with this life, right? So what ends up happening is something that I call recalculation. So it's kind of like, recalculation is kind of like what we do with the GPS, right? So if we miss our stop, right, what does the GPS do? It recalculates, right? So it recalculates another path, right, for you to get to your location. That's kind of what we do with the happiness constructs. We never actually find happiness with a happiness construct, right? It always leaves us with a void, a feeling of emptiness, right? And that emptiness occurs in varying degrees, but we're never truly happy. So what we end up doing is we recalculate. We figure out, well, what's the new way for me to be happy? This way isn't quite working. Usually it's if you just change like one little thing or tweak one little thing, then you'll finally be happy. That's what we do all the time, right? Sometimes it could be big things where some people are like, no, if I need to be happy, I need to drop everything and move across country, right? Or move to another country and find myself. So a lot of the girls do that, right? And I'll finally be happy. It's always something more. Just that one little thing, whether it be big or small, if you just do this thing, finally you'll find happiness, right? No, right? You'll never find it without God. But, when people engage in this, when they follow some happiness constructs, and when it doesn't make them happy, right, they recalculate, and when they recalculate, they either adjust the happiness construct or just kind of create a new one altogether, depending on how you want to define it, right? And then they follow a new happiness construct. And then if they end up getting to that, if they end up manifesting what that happiness construct says will make them happy, they're of course not going to be happy still if it's because it's not this, right? It's not God. And then they end up recalculating again. And this happens pretty much endlessly, right? So to go over this point, it says it's a continuation. Well, excuse me. So at this point, it says this becomes an endless loop, right? And so that's what pretty much everyone does pretty much our whole lives, right? We're always looking for what makes us happy, right? Because we're motivated to be happy, right? And everyone looks for true happiness, right? But you're never going to find it until you find God, right? And all born-again Christians know what I'm talking about, because we didn't find true happiness until we found Jesus, right? Until we had a true relationship with him. And then we're like, oh, this is what real happiness looks like. And it's completely different from this, because real happiness through Jesus Christ doesn't depend on all that nonsense that, our society generally says is important for happiness. We need to have money. We need to look good or be attractive, right? Or vacation to all these areas, right? That's all nonsense, right? That has nothing to do with what makes someone truly happy. And all the born-again Christians know what I'm talking about. Right. So yes, some people stay on that loop, just endlessly looking for happiness. Some people will stay on it for a very relatively short time. In other words, they figure out relatively early in life that God was the answer. This has to do with the young people who are born again Christians, right? I've seen people in their 20s, early 20s, almost teenagers, right, who realize that truth. It's amazing. Right? Some people don't realize it till way later in life, and some people never realize it, right? Some people are just stuck on that loop, endlessly looking for happiness, pretty much until they pass, right? They never figure it out that the solution was God. But if you don't figure it out, then you are pretty much going to stay on that loop forever, right? Some people check out, right? In fact, actually, let me go to this next point, because that's kind of what I'm getting at. Right, so to go to this next point here, it says HCs can result in 3 states. I'm just going to look at what that was. The HCs can result in 3 states of relative happiness, right? So when I say relative happiness, of course, I'm not talking about true happiness. It's the sort of fake form of happiness that we sort of look for in our society, right? Or we seek happiness in our society, but most we can get is this relative form of happiness, right? It's not true happiness according to the absolute reference frame. So in other words, if I have a happiness construct, right, I'm told that if I do this thing, I'll be truly happy, right? So let's say I'm told if I graduate from college and I get a job in engineering, then I'll be happy, right? That's what I'm told, right? There are 3 things that can result from following some happiness construct. There's 3 sort of, in a sense, manifestations. So when you manifest, the reality you manifest, that came from you producing a pattern of intentions that were meant to manifest a reality that had something that you were told is going to make you happy. There's 3 states that can result from that. So the first one is what I call impotency. So these are just kind of random terms, right? But it's just what I call impotency. So impotency occurs when you don't feel you have the power, right? You don't have the power to manifest what you were told is going to make you happy, right? So the reality you're in right now, you feel impotent, or you continue to manifest a reality where you're impotent, right? So this, for example, could be if I'm told that I need to have a nice house to truly be happy, right? A very big house, basically a mansion, right? I don't have the resources whatsoever, right, to get that, right? So if my happiness construct tells me that I need something to be happy that I don't think I'm able to manifest or able to achieve, then I'm going to just feel like I can't do this and I'm just always going to be unhappy, right? So that has to do with a negative want intention. So we talked about, when it comes to manifestation, how there's positive wanting and a negative wanting, right? So positive wanting feels more like ambition, determination, right? Vigor, right? You have a desire. You're telling yourself that you're going to achieve something no matter what, and nothing's going to stop you, right? When you keep charging that feeling, you feel motivated to take action, right? So that's why that's very important for the manifestation process. Those compulsions will affect what reality you're able to manifest. Now, when you have a negative one frequency, or you're charged up at a negative one frequency, that's more like a feeling of yearning, right? So that's, in that case, you would say, oh man, I really want this thing, but I'll never get it, right? I'm not good enough, or, I don't have the resources. It would take so long for me to do that, I'll never achieve that. I'll just have to deal with life without this thing, right? So if I keep thinking like that, right, I'm much less likely to take action, right? So the reality I manifest from that intention is not gonna be the reality that contains what I was told is gonna make me happy, right? So if I produce a negative one intention, generally it's gonna lead to impotency, right? Impotency as an outcome. So that's how a lot of people will respond to the general happiness construct of society, which I'm actually I don't know, I forgot to actually put that here, right? There was another thing I meant to put. Basically, no, I'll actually say it after this. So that's generally how we follow that's how many people will respond to the happiness construct of society, right? So we're primarily told that if we have money and nice things and we vacation and things like that and we live comfortably, then we'll be happy. Now, a lot of people aren't able to manifest a reality with those things, right? So they're in a state of impotency. They feel that their unhappiness is because they're unable to manifest these things they were told will make them happy. So this is not a great state, because happiness overall is an illusion according to this whole thing, right? The only thing that ever is going to make you happy was God, right? But if you think that your happiness can only come from you being a millionaire, then when you notice that you're unhappy, right, you're not going to attribute it to the fact that you were living a lie, right? That you were focused on an illusion. You're going to attribute it to the fact that, you didn't become a millionaire, right? And so this isn't good. This is what happens to a lot of the people. A lot of people who are able to actually get the things that they thought were going to make them happy, they are the ones who realize that they were following an illusion the whole time. In fact, that goes to this next point, which is negative potency. So basically, if you do manage to end up manifesting the reality that does have the thing your HC told you was going to make you happy, now there's two new conditions that you can be in as it relates to your happiness. There's two new states. So the first one is negative potency. So basically what I mean by that, it's when you have manifested reality, when you have the power to maintain, you have the power to achieve and maintain the thing you thought was going to make you happy. So why do I call it negative? Well, this is something I've noticed, and I observe in others. The way your subconscious works, so we talked about subconscious entropy, right? The way your subconscious works is that you can just develop negative memory, right? So your subconscious, of course, has experiences a phenomenon called entropy. So if you're focused on this thing that you were told was going to make you happy, you're just going to develop negative memory to it. It's not like, that didn't turn off, right? Because of you reached some HC, right? So let's say that I'm told that having a really nice house and nice cars and an attractive girl makes me happy, right? That's what I'm told is going to lead me to true happiness, right? So I do that, right? Let's say I take 10 years and I'm constantly manifesting this reality where I have I'm in this state of potency, right? So I have a business, right? I'm rich. I have the baddest chick in the world, right? I have nice cars. I vacation and whatever, right? And so I have nice things and materials. So I'm now happy. Well, what's going to happen on a subconscious level? Well, happiness largely, the true definition of happiness is just a void, right? But for a lot of us, we think of happiness as we attribute it to feelings, right? We attribute it to a feeling of pleasure and things like that, which, again, there's something I skipped, but I'll talk about that after. But let's say that's what I feel, right? So I want to experience joy from all of these things, right? All of these nice things that I have, and I probably will for a while. But remember, subconscious entropy is still there. It didn't get turned off, right? So of course, I'm just going to develop negative memory to all these things. I'm going to develop negative memory to the bad chick. I'm going to develop negative memory to the nice house. I'm going to develop negative memory to the nice cars and the vacation, the materials, and all these things. So when I develop negative memory to these things, now I no longer feel much from them, right? I no longer feel much of anything. And now guess what? I'm even more unhappy, right? So I wasn't happy to begin with because I didn't have a relationship with God. So I still felt something of a void, right? But I might not have noticed it as much, especially if everything was new to me, right? So if everything was new, and this also happens to young people as well, which we'll talk a little more about that later too. But if everything was new, maybe I'm feeling such a rush of emotion that I don't really notice the void as much now. I can kind of live with this state. But what happens? Eventually that goes away because of negative memory. Now I don't feel much of anything from all of these nice things, and I feel the void, right? So now I'm really unhappy, right? And this happens to lots of people. Well, again, I'd probably say most people are in a state of impotency, right? So we just keep thinking, well, if I just get $1 million, if I just get more money, I'll finally be happy. This is why people rob others and steal and things like that, because they keep believing that their state of unhappiness is a result of not having more, right? So they're impotent. But the people who managed to finally get to a state of potency, and they did get all these stuff that they were told was going to make them happy, they're unhappy too, right? And when they're unhappy, it's far more confusing, right? Because now they don't know what to do, right? They're like, I did the thing that I was told was going to make me happy. I put all of my manifestational energy into it, which a lot of times is idolatry, right? We talked about that in the last video. But I put all of my manifestational energy into this thing I was told was going to make me happy, and I'm still not happy. Now what, right? And so, of course, that leads to the recalculation process. And what a lot of rich people do is, because they have so much negative memory, what they'll try to do, they basically will need to focus on something that looks new again, right? So we talked about that in book 1 in chapter 12, right? If you focus on something that looks new, well, now you're going to shock charge it, right? So you're going to shock charge, and which is a little different from what I mentioned by shock charging. But in this particular case, different from the way I describe shock charging. But in this case, the way they shock charge themselves, right? So they feel stuff again, is they try to do more. They get more gross with it, right? So if I have $10 million, well, now I want $100 million, right? I want $100 million so I can feel that high of just feeling like I have wealth and abundance. I can buy even nicer things, a bigger house, right? With a bigger, bigger property. I can buy even nicer cars. I can even get I don't want to say a badder chick, right? But they do this too, right? So I'll instead of being with the same chick I was with, I'll be with a new chick, right? I'll be with multiple girls, right? Because now I'm in a state where the experience feels new again, right? So it's not as much negative memory to these chicks, right? And so I'll keep trying to do something to shock charge myself and try to get new experiences wherever I couldn't before, right? And now I feel something again. Of course, I'll just develop negative memory to these things as well, right? And then the process continues, right? And so this is what happens in a state of negative potency. And this is kind of similar to what Epicurus said, right? Where, I forget exactly what he said, something to the effect of certain pleasures are insatiable, which is similar to what I said about negative pleasures, right? Negative pleasures are insatiable. You can never be satisfied through them. But with these pleasures, right, the pleasures that come from what your HC told you was going to make you happy, right, they never actually do. Why? Because that was just an illusion, right? It didn't mean anything. Just because you were told this will make you happy didn't make it true, right? The true thing that was always going to make you happy was God, right? Because he's the only way to close the void. But, people engage in this illusion, disillusion the materialism and the material superstition, right? They end up following these things, which we just all make up in our heads. And of course, when it doesn't turn out to be true, like I said, people recalculate, and they kind of just keep doing this, and they stay on this loop, probably, like I said, pretty much forever, until they realize that the answer is God. And so this is why you see this from rich people, you see it from celebrities, right? That you see that they will constantly just need more money, more fame, more of something. And then when they develop negative memory to that, they just need more, and it's endless, right? It has a very parasitic effect on society. So we talked about how, if a certain group of people engage in these behaviors, right, or if enough people manifest, right, certain realities where they have these conditions, that can have effect overall on the entire population, especially as it relates to the economy, right? It can have a very parasitic effect on the planet, right? And it can make it worse for everyone in terms of global manifestation, right? And so that's the kind of situation that we're in today, with our capitalist society, and that comes from the fact that a lot of people at the top, so that comes from the fact that a lot of people at the top believe that true happiness comes from money and things like that, right? And we also talked about reality conditions. So the reality that they manifest globally is going to have a lot of the conditions that match the frequency of greed and avarice and selfishness, which is why it's so hard for this economy to sort of work for everyone, right? If it's working for a lot of people at the top, that's because it was manifested that way, and it was manifested based on intentions that will create reality conditions of selfishness. So that messes up for everyone. But still, that's one state. That's the second state that can result from following an HC. So what is the third one? So the third state is positive potency. So that's a rare one because most people don't know how to do this, right? This is actually a state that I've reached, right? In my life, that's how I know it exists. So positive potency is basically, it's almost as happy as you can ever get using through relative happiness, or you following an HC. It's the highest state of happiness. But you're still not truly happy, right? So positive potency is basically just when you have all those things of negative potency, but you actually manage to charge your subconscious, right? Most people don't know how to do that. They don't know how to get around the negative memory problem, right? I did, right? And so if you do know how to get around the negative memory problem, you can just keep charging your subconscious endlessly and feel a huge amount of positive emotion, right? And you can do that endlessly and really feel like a great sense of emotional pleasure and euphoria, but that's still, you're still going to feel the void. You got no choice but to feel it, right? You can't control that, right? Because that only closes when you have a relationship with God. But it may be a little more manageable if you can just charge your energy endlessly, right? So that happened to me, right? So when I finally learned how to, now I wasn't trying to be a millionaire or anything like that, right? But when I finally learned how to control my subconscious and charge my emotions and things like that, and I talked about that in book 1, I was like I would have described myself as super happy initially, right? So I was extremely happy. I felt emotional euphoria, right? I was in a great mood every single day, right? It was just wonderful for me. I felt so good, right? But I would pick certain different frequencies and just charge them up, and I would feel amazing. But the problem is that I felt empty, right? Because like I said, to reach those higher levels of emotional euphoria, I had to avoid engaging in anything that would challenge me, because then I would produce intentions that get stored to my short-term memory, then it dampened my charge overall. So I had to avoid challenges to reach that higher level. So in other words, I wasn't engaging in purpose, right? And that's why and pleasure is antithetical to purpose. Now, because I wasn't engaging much with purpose, but just focused on feeling good, right? I did feel good, but I felt good in terms of just a positive emotional frequency. But that's not what true happiness is, and I felt it, right? So as good as I still felt the void at the same time, and I'm like, man, why does this feel empty? So the same thing that happened, that I'm talking about, happened to me, right? So at that time, I didn't know as much about spiritual energy and all of these stuff. I didn't come up with that yet. I did know about connecting to God, but I didn't really understand these principles yet, right? And so I assumed if I just felt good all the time, then that would make me true. That's what it means to be truly happy. And I realized it wasn't, right? At least if I felt a lot of positive emotions. And I realized that really wasn't it. It kind of didn't have that much to do with happiness, right? So I felt a void and I felt empty. And eventually I realized the key to true happiness was following God, right? And the same thing, even when I used to watch adult titles, right? So I used to watch that, and I used to charge my subconscious, right, at a sexual frequency. I could go into detail, but let's just say I would do it, and basically it was like doing drugs, right? Because I would charge it, and I would time certain things, right? But I would feel this enormous euphoria. But now this is a negative pleasure, right? This is lust, so it's negative pleasure. But I can make it feel so insanely euphoric, right? Like I said, it was basically the same as doing drugs. But in the process of doing that, I still felt the void. Now, to be clear, it's funny because when I was doing it, I didn't feel as much of the void as I used to when I used to do it when I wasn't charging. So at first I thought like, oh, well, the way I'm doing it now is good, it's okay. Because I didn't feel the same amount of darkness and emptiness I felt before. But that's only because I was charging it. I was getting around the negative memory problem. But it wasn't really, but I still felt the void and the sin and all of that to a degree, right? Then when I stopped, I really felt, when I felt the goodness of God again, I recognized then how much darkness I was still in. Just because it didn't feel as much of the darkness and just because it didn't feel as bad as before, right, didn't mean it wasn't still bad, right, compared to now, right, that I was like in a very dark place, right? And but like I said, when I ended up stopping it, right, I started having a whole bunch of demonic entities enter my dreams. So in other words, they had that power the whole time because of how deep into sin I was, right? They just don't often use that power because, you know, they like you to have a false sense of security, right? But my point is that this is positive potency, right? So if celebrities and people knew how to do that, they would probably be much more happy than they are, right? Much more happy than when they're in a state of negative potency, and that can create more of an illusion. So that's actually a dangerous state to be in because it's more of a lukewarm, it makes the lukewarm state more easy to be in, more palatable, right? So you could probably be stuck there, right? But ultimately you will still have a void and you won't be happy. But like I said, that's a rare state because most people don't know how to do that. What does happen, what I will say sometimes, no, never mind, I was going to say something, but that's still really a consequence of the second state. So what I wanted to say that I forgot to put here is modern society. So this is the absolute reference frame of happiness, right? Now, modern society follows the relative reference frame, so just one we make up in our heads, right? But the general happiness construct that we follow as a society, the general happiness construct that we follow as a society is largely escapism, right? So escapism, like I said, I mentioned it before, is basically I'll adapt it to, escapism itself is basically just focusing on things that will cause you to feel a positive emotion, experience a sense of pleasure. And I'll just say it, escapism is basically the belief that you can be happy by just focusing on things that make you feel good and avoiding things that make you feel uncomfortable, right? You want to maximize, I should say, experiences that make you feel good and minimize experiences that make you uncomfortable, right? So that's basically what escapism is. And our society basically follows that general happiness construct, right, with escapism, right? And so that idea is drilled into pretty much all of our heads since birth, right? It is drilled into us, right? That and internalized through our culture and our engaging with our culture and different aspects of our culture and institutions in our culture and things like that, and different institutions in society. Basically, it's drilled into us that if we engage, that true happiness comes from escapism. So basically focusing on all these worldly experiences and secular experiences that we believe will make us happy and cause us to feel good and cause us pleasure, right? And just trying to minimize difficulty, right? And so a lot of cases that means trying to be rich and then not working, right? So not working, not having to work or grind 9 to 5 and things like that. We want to just go on vacation and things like that. So that's the modern sort of theory of happiness. And so that's the theory of happiness that society drills into our heads. And so what all of us generally try to do to obtain that happiness is we try to get power, right? So what do I mean by power in this case? Well, by power, I just mean a sense of control over your local reality, right? Generally, it's negative power. So negative power is a term I use. Basically just means an illusionary kind of power that we just kind of, where we can gain in human society, right? But it's not true power. True power only comes from God, right? And true power has to do with providence. So we talked about that last video, and that's when basically Holy Spirit is helping you to manifest the will of God. That's real power, right? And that's the power that demonic entities recognize. That's the important one. They know that all this other nonsense we create in our heads, right, doesn't really mean anything. They know true power comes from God, and so that's why they're so focused on sort of getting you not to follow the will of God, because they know there's nothing they can do to override God or override the Holy Spirit or any of that. It's impossible, right? So they don't want us to access our true power, which we also get through our relationship with Jesus Christ. When we have a strong relationship with Jesus, we get the full authority. We get greater authority in the Holy Spirit over the spirit realm, and we have a much greater ability to manifest our will as a result of the power of the Holy Spirit. So it's also something demons know. They don't want, that's why they hate born again Christians the most, right? Because we're the biggest threat, right? We have the most power to manifest the will of God over everyone else because of our strong relationship with Jesus Christ, right? But just going back to this, right? So demons know that, and they recognize real power, which comes from God. Fake power is the one we just create in this human world. It doesn't mean anything, but except to us. So fake power generally is like basically just related to money, right? And so that's why generally everybody wants money, right? We want money so that we can have negative power, and we can use that negative power to change our reality so that we can manifest conditions associated with society's prescription of true happiness, right? So society prescribes to us the idea that true happiness can be reached, right, if we are able to engage in escapism. And escapism in that case can occur on various levels, right? So if we get, if we have lots of money, which represents negative power, if we have lots of money, then we can go on vacation, we can have nice things, right? We can buy nice things, we can relax, we don't have to work, so we minimized our uncomfortable experiences, right? We don't really have to challenge ourselves, right? I can have nice women, right? So I can have all these sort of nice experiences, right? And so I'm maximizing my pleasurable experiences, right? And so that's why we want money. So that's the modern theory of happiness, right? Now what ends up happening from that, and that's kind of what I want to go into these, when people in the search or in response to that theory of happiness generally end up in one of these three conditions, right? So most of society, I imagine, is in the impotency case, right? So we can't truly get this state that society told us will make us happy, right? So a lot of people will just say, oh man, if I just had this one thing, or if I just was able to achieve all these things society told me will make me happier, I'll be unhappy, and that's why I'm unhappy, right? And then the people who can obtain those things, like celebrities and rich people and things like that, they end up realizing that no, none of this really made me happy. It didn't make any difference, right? In other words, they run into the truth of reality. And that's kind of what I was mentioning last video, that you can only get away with ignoring the truth for so long. So ignorance is a luxury while truth is a necessity, right? So what does that mean? Well, basically it means that if you can afford to not know the truth in some particular state that you're in, consider it a luxury, right? Because what it means is reality hasn't sort of forced you to recognize the truth yet, right? It hasn't forced you to sort of come to terms with the fact that you are living a lie, right? But if you live a lie long enough, eventually reality is going to kind of force you to recognize the truth because of the inconsistency with what you believed and what you're observing, right? So truth is a necessity in the sense that everyone can afford it, right? So if you think about luxury and necessities are things that pretty much everyone can afford, and luxuries are things that only some people can afford, right? People who are wealthy. That's kind of how I like to think about it between truth and ignorance. So ignorance is a luxury, right? In the sense that if you can afford to think that all these things will make you happy, right? Consider it a luxury. But sooner or later, right? When you come face to face with all these things and you do happen to obtain all these things you thought was that society told you was going to make you happy, right? Eventually you come face to face with the truth. And you're like, and this happens all the time with people. When they finally get the thing they were told was going to make them happy, they're like, you know what? I'm not actually happy, right? I don't think that this didn't turn out the way I thought it would. Now there is an exception to this. So just to be clear, one exception is if you, let's say I want to be a doctor, right? And I believed that all my life I was going to be happy being a doctor, and I'm a doctor, and then I'm actually happy, right? Well, that comes from soul purpose, right? So we talked about that, right? So if someone's sole purpose is to be a healer in that way, then yes, they are going to be happy by being a doctor. But then that's in accord with this guy, because in the process of manifesting the will of God, God's will is for you to be a doctor, right? It's part of your soul purpose. So that's why you're happy, right? It's not actually a part of the happiness construct, right? So when I say a happiness construct, I'm excluding this guy. So some people might confuse them, but I'm specifically talking about things that that you're doing just from society, and it's not part of your soul purpose. So I just wanted to make that distinction, right? But yeah, so a lot of times people who end up actually reaching a state of negative potency, right, and they get all the things, the nice cars, the women, the houses that they were told was going to make them happy, they'll all tell you the same thing, right, that they're not truly happy. It's almost like society lied to me, right? Or put another way, because really we're following the atheist model for all these things, right? The atheist model is basically, like I said before, that all of life is meaningless. There's no point to anything we do, right? There's no absolute prescription of happiness. It's just something we make up in our heads randomly, right? And of course they'll say, oh, no, right? We're going to the material needs of the body or something like that, or the brain. So that's how they rationalize it. But in reality, really, it's just, nothing means anything. There's no point to anything. Everything's relative. The best way to live is just something we all make up in our heads. And then we die, and leave this meaningless life, right? So that's basically the scope of atheist logic, right? And so, of course, that's wrong and doesn't make any sense, right? So when people live according to this sort of, this nonsense, in my opinion, and they obtain this form of happiness that they were told, they were promised by society, it was drilled into their heads, right, that this would make them happy, when they finally get it, they're not happy, right? And it's, like I said, they start to recognize, it almost seems like pretending that there was no God didn't actually make it so. Who would have thunk, right? That's basically a revelation to an atheist, right, and materialist. But no, right? So you'll hoodwink people into believing all this nonsense, right? It never ends up working. They're always unhappy, right? And so they end up recalculating, and they wonder, what does it take to be happy? What makes me happy, right? And then, like I said, eventually they'll probably just stay on this loop forever, right? Or they will stay on this loop forever. Well, let me put it another way. They'll stay on this loop until they recognize that God was always the answer. Jesus Christ was the answer, right? And if they don't realize that, then yes, they'll just stay on this loop forever or their whole lives, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's basically how happiness generally works, right? And that's kind of what happens to society, because we don't follow the law of happiness. We follow relative happiness, and that idea kind of comes from what we're told from materialists who just make up random rules about reality and sort of hope that it's true, right? And every time something deviates, every time people have experiences that deviate from this random thing they just made up in their heads, right, they'll just come up with some excuse about, and that's kind of where this recalculation thing comes into place, right? Oh, no, if you just do this, if you just do that, if you just do more things, right, you'll finally be happy, right? And that's exactly what they do, right? So that's what the atheists do, right? When there's all these experiences that people have, and, including consciousness, emotions. We talked about this in chapter 2, right? All of these experiences go against what we would expect in a universe that doesn't have a God in it, right? Every time we see this, they're like, oh, no, one day science will figure it out, and it could have been this, and it could have been that. Maybe it was just in this person's head, and they imagined there was some illusion. There's always some excuse that science will magically figure out one day, right? So they apply that same thing here, and they kind of want people to do that with their happiness, right? When they pretend there's no God, and of course they're unhappy as a result of that, they'll just say, oh, no, if you do this to be happy, if you just get this little thing more, then finally you'll be happy, right? Like, I watch Young Turks, right? And I like Young Turks for the most part, but there's this thing that there's a host called Cenk Uygur, this thing that he does where he talks about Operation Joy, I think. And I think he just kind of, I don't watch it too much, but I think he kind of teaches people how to be happy. And he's one of those atheists who demonstrate atheist overcompensation. So I think I mentioned that in one of my other videos before. Atheist overcompensation is basically just when an atheist tries really hard to let everyone know they don't believe in God, but really it's just an insecurity, right? They do believe in God. You can't take away knowledge of God from your subconscious. On a conscious level, you can call that inner knowing different things, and you can make up whatever definition of God you feel like, right? But there's a God, everyone does, right? Like I said, that's what's also is basically alluded to in that near-death experience book, Why Are There Monkeys? So he's one of those people who goes crazy to try to get people to recognize that he doesn't believe in God, right? But it's atheist overcompensation. They're overcompensating for their insecurity for the fact that they know there's a God, but different atheists have different reasons. We talked about it before. It's some reason based on fear that they want to believe, that they want to pretend that it's true that there is no God, right? Even though they know that's not the case. So he does that a lot, right? But has this sort of thing about Operation Joy where he'll tell people to kind of, focus less on this and try not to focus on things that worry you and things like that. And ostensibly the ideas themselves are good. But when I hear it, I'm like, obviously they tried a lot of these ideas already, right? It didn't work, right? In other words, it didn't lead to true happiness, right? It maybe left to some degree of happiness here, some more happiness in this part of their life, and things like that. But it didn't lead to true happiness, right? And that's what always happens, right? And that's we're actually talking about that a little later. That's what always happens in the self-help community, right? They always think that all these little things, which is basically what I meant by recalculation, all these little things, if I just do this way and have this way of thinking, I'll finally be happy. No, people have tried that, right? It didn't work. That's why they recalculated from it, right? But yeah. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention was so I mentioned the modern theory of happiness. People engage in escapism, right? And so they have this idea that if they maximize their experiences that cause them pleasure and minimize experiences that cause them discomfort, right? Then they'll be truly happy. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is you notice when I said pleasure, I didn't make a distinction between negative pleasure and positive pleasure, right? Because that's obviously very important, right? Because positive pleasures are aligned with the Spirit of God. Excuse me. So, like I was saying, positive pleasures are aligned with the Spirit of God, right? So the more positive pleasures you experience, you actually get closer to God. You draw nearer to Him. And with negative pleasures, of course, you move further away from God, right? So it is important to recognize the difference between the two types of pleasure, which is what we have done, right? Because it's the proper way to look at things metaphysically. But for the modern theory of happiness that society follows, in terms of the HC or the happiness construct, there's no difference, right? It's just pleasure and that's it, right? That's what escapism generally is, just focusing on pleasure. Doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, right? Of course you're gonna really be confused, right? If you're just following pleasure, right? That could be negative pleasures, could be lust, could be greed, could be pride, laziness, right? Which is what you see, right? When people get a lot of money, so they enter the state of negative potency, right? And they get a lot of money, what do they engage in? They do engage in lust and laziness, right? After a while, especially people who win the lottery and they have all this money, they become lazy. They don't want to work, right? They just want to sit around experiencing pleasure all day, right? Not good. So yeah, I thought that was important. I wanted to mention that. So now to get into this kind of portion here, I want to start talking a little more about examples. Actually, no, I want to discuss this last point here. So to go over this is kind of the overall idea, right, that results from this guy, right? So this is looking at this sort of, this is applying this principle on a global scale as it relates to global manifestation. Right, let's go over this point. Here it says, humanity will never evolve past a certain point without God, right? And I put history repeats itself. So in other words, to create the society with the greatest sense of happiness, or the greatest amount of happiness, right? And that's pretty much what we want in a good society. In a society that we would think to be a good or evolved society, right? It has more happiness, right? So I'm not just talking about technology, right? Just in terms of what we would consider to be a good society, right? So if we recognize that all people are entangled in terms of our pattern of intentions and the global reality that we manifest, right? If we think of all the future realities where our society is like this and our society is like that and that society has these conditions, right? The reality that had the greatest amount of happiness in it is going to be the one that is manifested by the Spirit of God, right? It's God directing all of us, right? In us behaving according to the likeness of Jesus Christ, right? And being directed by the Holy Spirit. So that's the reality where humanity is the most happy, right? And if on a global scale, if the majority of people are not acceding to the direction of the Holy Spirit, right, then we're not going to evolve, right? Now, because just like I talked about here, where you'll be on this kind of, I forgot to actually mention it here, I call it a happiness carousel, right? So sometimes I use that term. It's basically just a loop, right? Being on an endless loop that you only get off when you find God, right? So society works the same way. This is the microcosm of that phenomenon, so just an individual person's life, but it also works as a macrocosm, right? So it works for a whole society. Society also will, in a sense, be on a loop, right? Now that loop, now this is my belief, right? That loop takes too long to sort of come back around for one person's lifetime, right? And this is why I often say that if people lived like 1,000 years, everybody would know God and we would have the most perfect society possible, right? Because by that would be long enough for everyone to sort of recognize, oh, they would have tried enough things and recalculated enough to realize that the answer was always God, right? It was God that whole time. And then once all of society does that, then you would manifest the most perfect society quite easily, right? So the fact that people live such short lives relative to how long it would take to loop for a whole society, it's why, a person can be born into this world, see how messed up it is, sort of engage in this sort of carousel for a good chunk of their life, right? Some of the people get off eventually and find God. Some people stay on it until they pass, right? So they didn't live long enough to recognize that God was the answer, right? And when people get into this world and see all their problems, when people come into this world, they're born into this world and see all the problems, right? They give their own, they want to, not everyone does this, but some people will try to make a difference, or they want to change in some way. They want the world to change. So at least everyone does want that, right? And we have different attitudes and different beliefs on how to go about creating the most perfect society, but ultimately, it's just us having all these ideas, which none of it's really going to work, right? And I'm going to actually talk about that a little later, especially when I talk about the government portion. Because most people want to change and create the most perfect society by government. Please, right? The answer is always going to be God, right? That's it. It's not going to there's nothing you can do, right? And I say history repeats itself basically to say that no matter, even if society can get more evolved in one sense, just like we can be more happy in one moment of our life, and then another moment of our life will be less happy, right? But ultimately, we're going to kind of hover around a certain amount of happiness or go lower, but we never really go past a certain point because we're not actually following the will of God, right? Society's the same way, right? It may evolve up to a point, and then it can lose its way. People can lose their way and sort of devolve in a sense, right? But society will never evolve past a certain point without the majority of that society learning to act according to the will of God, right? So that's what I believe, right? So this is the underlying principle behind what you might call metaphysical sociology, right? And so ultimately, what you can now sort of recognize from this are sort of different institutions and different sort of things we observe in our society on the macro scale. And I'd argue that you could break down all of it and sort of just recognize where the unhappiness comes from, and you could kind of pinpoint what's causing it. There's always going to be the thing that deviated from this guy. And what I believe, actually, before I even move forward, is that I believe that it's like a lot of people think that people back in the day, right? People, in traditional ancient times, that they were so backwards and they were so barbaric in a lot of ways, right? And their society or their governments were extremely barbaric, and we're so much better today. We're so civilized, right? I argue no, right? I don't think that's true at all, right? And I agree that, I believe that, yes, there were societies back in the day that were barbaric, right? And there was corruption and things like that. But I believe that if I were to really do the research, and I haven't necessarily done it yet, but I believe if I did the research, right, I would find that there are many people, right? Now that's a relative term, right? But I argue that I would find many people back then, probably more than today, or at least comparable to more than today per capita, right? I think would be the right way to say it, right? But I would find a lot of people back then, relative to how many people there are today, that were truly happy, right? They didn't have all this corruption and all these negatives that we see today in our society, right? And the reason is because I think that people back then, or back in the day, were more in tuned with the Spirit of God. They might not have had it all the way, right? They might not have, because there's different levels to having a relationship with God, which we're actually going to talk about those in a later video, later in the chapter, right? But they were probably closer on average than most of us, right? And I believe largely that, and I'll talk a little more about this in the next video, right? When we talk about the law of knowing. But having a relationship with God, it's like there's a distance to it, right? So you could be further away from God and closer to him. Now that's true in terms of spiritual energy, but right now I'm talking about in terms of one's relationship, right? And we'll talk more about this, when we're talking about stages of relationship with God, right? And getting to know God and going further into your relationship with him, right? It requires you to rely less on your logical intelligence, and that's really because human intelligence is so small and is so tiny. God is far beyond human understanding, but we still have a chance to kind of make a little more sense of God through our intuition, right? Which is really just saying our subconscious mind, right? But we generally recognize it as our intuition, right? And I feel like in modern society, right, because we believe in material superstition, right? So we believe that all of life is meaningless, there's no spiritual anything. Everything is based on, materials and emotions and thoughts. They all come from our material mind. And anything that we can't explain, science will magically, figure out one day, right? And then we have all these kind of nonsensical prescriptions based on these superstitious beliefs, right? And what I believe is that they didn't have that back in the day, right? They had supernatural superstitious beliefs, yes, but they were more in tune with their intuition, right? Because their intuition is supernatural. So that allowed them to kind of make more sense of spiritual phenomena, and they were able to become more tuned into God. That's what I believe. If I did the research, I imagine I would see that. I haven't done it yet, I could be wrong. But I believe that to be the case, right? And so today, in the modern world, right, not only is it the case that we're told to have these material superstitious beliefs, but also we're so bombarded with information, right? So this is the information age, right? We're bombarded with information that we can't fully process and make sense of, right? And I see this all the time. Like, something that I've noticed that people do, right? And I've learned not to do this through my relationship with Jesus Christ. People have this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? They have this conceit, right, about the scope of human intelligence, right? The height of human intelligence and human capability, right? And I'm just like, please, like, I've seen the intelligence and the ability of the angels, of God, my higher self. And I'm like, our intelligence compared to them is like nothing, right? It's like, I don't know if I mentioned before, it's like the intelligence of like a smartest ant compared to like Einstein, right? It doesn't even compare, right? So I don't think in that way. At least, I don't know if I used to, but I definitely don't anymore, where I'm thinking like, there's always a way where human intelligence can achieve a certain outcome. No, right? There's many things that we can't achieve. There's many things that's virtually impossible for us to understand as we currently are. We're meant to rely on God and rely on the Holy Spirit, right? Like I said before, humans are fundamentally incomplete without God. We're meant to rely on them for intelligence and inspiration and things like that, right? So when we try to do these things on our own, it often leads to error and mistakes and things like that. And I see it all the time, right? Especially when people are debating, right? And I always say like debating is overrated too. Because I'm like, debating is not the proper format to process information in a detailed or highly well thought out way. Like, I guarantee you I could debate like a pulmonary doctor, right? So I could debate a doctor on whether or not people breathe air, right? I guarantee you if I do it just right, we can have a heated debate on it, right? Obviously people breathe air, but I could debate it, right? I can make it look sort of legit, like a legitimate belief that, this idea that people really don't breathe air, right? And so that you can always do that with debate. And I see people in debates, they always, in logic theory, I think it's called appeal to authority fallacy. They'll always appeal to some authority and say, oh, what did this authority structure say? What did this authority structure say? Right? And when they have bulk reporting data, any bulk reporting data could easily be manipulated to make whatever you want appear to be true, right? I know there are certain experimental methods that approach the concept of science, right? And they engage in semi-empirical data, which we talked about in chapter 2, right? But you can manipulate it, right? To kind of say whatever you feel like. So how do you understand what's happening in the world around you when the bulk data sources you're getting, when you have to rely on them to be accurate? In many cases, they may not be accurate, right? Or they're not collecting data properly, right? They they're misreporting things. There's really no way to know if you have to trust these human sources, right? Like even me, like I remember, like I live in New York, right? And I'm kind of going off a little bit of tangent, but I'll kind of get back to this in a moment. But I'm in New York, and like not so much now, right? Crime has slowed down a little bit, but I remember like maybe like 1 or 2 years after COVID, right? Really like 2021, I would say, to 2023, roughly during that time, right? I saw like so much. I saw so much crime. I saw more crime in my personal life, like seeing it where I was. I saw more crime than I think I've ever seen in my whole life, right? And I'm hearing some people say like online, oh, there's no crime and there's no this, right? I'm like, I don't know how you're collecting that data, but I know for me personally, I've seen more crime than I've ever seen, right? And I don't know where this sort of push to convince people there's no crime is coming from, right? And so, and maybe, it is possible that it increased in some areas, decreased in other areas, and the overall net effect is not really there. But I don't know, it doesn't seem like that, right? So my intuition is telling me something different, right? And so what do you do when your intuition tells you something that's different from bulk data reporting? Well, we're told in modern society, oh, your experience is anecdotal and you have to trust the science or the semi-empirical data, that's more reliable. But it's only as reliable as the human source that collected the data, right? So you can't always get palatable information about anything. That's just the way it is. That is a limit of human knowledge, right? So when you're making decisions and things like that, and you're sort of forming your beliefs off these bulk reporting data methods, right, or these bulk reporting data reports, right, it can be very difficult to sort of land on the right answer, and this is part of the limit of human knowledge. This is why we rely on the Holy Spirit, right? And I see it all the time where people try to do this, and it's like they keep needing some authority, some informational authority to exist, and they almost have this idea of like it being like gospel or something, like they can't just be wrong, right? And we're trained ultimately to ignore intuition because it's not supernatural, right? It's just some random thing in our material mind. And so we focus too much logic on our logic, right? Or on human logic, which is flawed, right? It's not that, it's not that good compared to the performance level is not that high compared to the spirit realm. We're not expected to use our human logic to create the most perfect society and solve all of our problems. But we're trained, right, to do that, to try to do that anyway, and we're sort of bombarded with so much information that we can't really handle it, we can't make sense of it. I can look at any set piece of information and think the whole world reflects this thing I've seen because I've seen so much of it, right? No, that's not the proper way to sort of analyze reality. But ultimately, what I was basically getting at with that is I feel like modern humans have lost their way because of that. Right? We're too bombarded with information that we can't make sense of. We don't trust our intuition, which is actually the thing that's going to help us connect to God. And again, we'll talk more about it in the next chapter. God is meant to be confusing to our logical minds, but God makes much more sense to your intuition. That's how you would find him. Right? Like all of this stuff I'm telling you about God intellectually, that is not normal. I think I might mention that in the next video too, because I already recorded it, right? But it is unusual, right? And I believe maybe this has to do with my soul purpose or whatever, but normally you would find God through your intuition. That's what only born-again Christians do, right? So yeah, I believe we lost our way. A lot of traditional societies, I believe, probably were much closer to God than us, so they weren't as corrupted, right? And we're made to believe that all of these modern civilized things, right, and technology and things like that make us more civilized or closer to God, when that's not true, right? We just swap one sin or one fault that traditional society had, let's say it's slavery, for example, we just swap it with another one, and today it would be hedonism, right? So that's basically just to kind of set that up. So now to go into this one. So one thing I want to just acknowledge about one of the things that modern society does that doesn't lead to happiness because it deviates from the will of God is employment distribution, right? So that's this point here. So what do I mean by that? Basically, this piggybacks off what I said in the last video, right? So we think, because we believe in material superstition, right, that everyone was just born for no reason, and we just pick whatever we feel like, in terms of our profession and what we seek as we get older. No, that is not how it works. Metaphysically, like I said, we have soul purpose. We have divine purpose. We have purposes that were given to us from God and from our higher self, right? There are things we're supposed to do, right? And God has given us gifts that we're meant to use to serve him and help carry out his will and manifest his kingdom on this planet, right? And so we're not actually free to just do whatever, right, in the way that is often presented, right? Like, I would never be as happy, right, being a musician. I do like making music, but I would never be happy only being a musician. I wouldn't be happy, right? I could pretty much do almost anything in science, right? But I wouldn't be happy being like an accountant or something, or working in finance, or being a cop, right, or a lawyer. Right? I could do those things, but I would truly be unhappy, or a cook. Why? Because it's not the way God made my spirit. God made my spirit so I'd feel the highest sense of purpose and joy, right? Engaging in what I'm doing now, which is theory, right? I've been doing that since I was a kid. I love doing that and been doing it ever since. And by the way, it had nothing to do with money, right? It still doesn't have anything to do with money, right? It's actually costing me money to kind of do all this stuff, right? So it's completely unrelated to money, right? But I do it because it's what I love to do. It is how God made my spirit, right? Another person, God will have made their spirit to enjoy art, right? For another person, they want to be an actor or work in theater, or another person, they're a singer, right? In other words, people have certain gifts. There are certain things that they're just going to enjoy the most, and there's nothing or anyone else can do about it, right? Some of those gifts are tied to high-paying professions, like a doctor who's meant to be a healer, and some of those gifts are not, right? Like me, right? So even though I could do anything in science, right? A metaphysical theoretician, right, wouldn't really make a lot of money, right? But to be fair, no, I could still do almost anything in science. Like I could do engineering, I could do math, I could do physics. But someone who's meant to be, let's say, an artist, who's just a brilliant painter or sculptor, right? Like in ancient Greece, like people like that were considered to be, I think they had a higher status in society, right? In the modern society, they would not, right? Most of them, right? Architects would have a good high status, but that's a little different, right? But someone who's meant to engage in art or sculpting and things like that, right? There are still people today. It's not like God stopped doing that, right? Just because our society decided to change, right? There are people today who that is their gift. That's what they love to do, and they enrich our society, right? God has a plan. His plan is perfect, right? God has people who are meant to be the entertainers, right? They enrich society through their artwork, right? And art is a quality of God, right? But our society does not value these people in the same way it values like lawyers or something, or people who are meant to be leaders. These would be like business owners or congressmen. And there are people who are meant to sort of engage in government administration, right? So I believe people are born with that gift as well, right? So they're meant to help our country run and things like that. There are people who are meant to be cops, the enforcers of society, right? But the problem with modern society is that we value these professions differently, right? In some of these professions, people who have some of these gifts, let's say someone's gift is to be a great poet, right? I believe those still exist today, right? We don't value these people, their gifts that God gave them, and because of that, we don't value them through employment. And because of that, right, these people, it's going to be hard for them to use their gift as like a full-time job to make money from, right? They're going to have to work at some other full-time job where they won't be happy, right? And because they're doing that, now they don't have as much manifestational energy left over for their actual gift, right? And so this is not good. So this is something that I believe is a problem with modern society. We way over straticize, I don't know what the right word is, right? But we sort of segregate, right? We segregate the value of professions a little too much, right? Or we divide them up into too many categories to create this like deep social strata related to them, right? And anybody who doesn't have the gifts, who God didn't give the gifts that our society currently values, right? They're going to be unhappy. And that's going to be a problem for all of society, right? If certain sections or subgroups of society are unhappy, you don't want to do that, right? That's not going to be a society that reflects the goodness of God, right? Because those people can now go lead, their unhappiness can lead to other problems. Maybe they go into drugs or they steal or something else, right? And then, of course, society will just say, oh, go to therapy or something, right? As if another person is going to solve a problem like this, right? And that comes from believing in material superstition. So the other problem with our modern society, and this is a big one, right, is hedonistic culture, right? So, so over this point, it says hedonistic culture prevents true happiness. And this is what I believe. Like, I believe that one of the biggest problems of modern society is that we practice hedonism, right? Because again, our modern theory of happiness focuses on pleasure, maximizing pleasure. We make no distinction between negative pleasure or positive pleasure, right? We just maximize pleasure. And following the will of God isn't just about pleasure. So that's something very important I forgot to talk about, which that's something Buddha also realized, right? Buddha recognized that, for one, just having riches and all that didn't actually lead to true happiness, right? And that suffering was actually a part of life. In other words, true happiness includes suffering. It includes a component of discomfort. You're not actually looking to completely minimize your discomfort, right? You do want to minimize negative suffering. So this, again, there's a distinction between there's a distinction where there's negative suffering and positive suffering, right? Positive suffering brings you closer to God. Negative suffering moves you away from Him. So what's an example of positive suffering? Which I think we mentioned before, but positive suffering, one of the big ones, is overcoming temptation, right? When you're overcoming temptation, it can feel extremely difficult. It can feel hard to do it, right? But it can feel painful at times, right? So if you're overcoming an addiction, for example, right? But when you do it, you feel closer to God, right? So that's a uncomfortable situation. Now, if you're engaging in escapism, what often happens, if you're addicted to something, you just give in to the addiction, right? Because that reduces the discomfort, right? And you get a somewhat pleasurable experience, but the void increases. The God's Spirit is not able to, God's Spirit won't move in your life as much now, I believe, because you have engaged in that sin. And it's always pretty much going to be a sin to give into that. Right? And so the void is going to stick around. You may have a temporary experience of pleasure, but you're still going to feel empty in the end, right? And you won't experience true happiness. So hedonism, right? Hedonism basically, I was talking about suffering, right? So that's an example of positive suffering, right? Other examples are when you forgive someone who you feel has wronged you, but you forgive them anyway. And that can be hard, right? Because it feels like you're rewarding their being wrong to you, but you still feel good for it. You feel a positive, a pure feeling as a result of doing that, and that's because you got a little bit closer to God by doing it. So the void closed just a little bit, right? And so that's an example of positive suffering. Trying to reach someone who's spitting in your face, that's hard. Sometimes you may even donate, maybe like a kidney or something, right? Or you may step in front of some danger to save someone, and now you're hurt, right? Now you're actually physically suffering. So suffering is a part of the equation, right? Sometimes just pushing yourself to obtain a particular goal or carry out a particular purpose. For me, it's public speaking, right? You may push yourself to do something that makes you really uncomfortable for the greater good, right? So positive suffering brings you closer to God, right? Negative suffering is pretty much just anything you do that's against the will of God, right? So engaging in negative pleasures will increase the feeling of the void and leads to negative suffering, right? Kind of attacking yourself, low self-esteem is a version of negative suffering, and things like that, right? If I'm constantly trying to fight everyone or dominate everyone, right? Someone will eventually attack me or whatever, that's negative suffering, right? Or if I'm the head of a cartel and everyone's trying to kill me, right, to take over my empire, and I'm constantly paranoid, and that can be a form of suffering. That's negative suffering, right? So there's positive suffering and there's negative suffering, right? But hedonistic culture, right, the goal is just to minimize the suffering altogether, right? Whether it's positive or negative makes no difference, right? You want it to be at a minimum, right? And you want to maximize pleasure, right? And the problem with doing that is that, of course, because you don't make any distinction between negative pleasure, negative suffering, or positive suffering, right? You're going to deviate from this guy, and so there's going to be chaos, right? Of course. That's exactly what you see in modern society, right? So I believe that's one of the biggest problems with our society, right? Capitalism and technology, all these things have sort of increased our ability to follow this sort of theory of happiness, right? Of escapism through negative power. And what it has ultimately led to is hedonistic culture, where we deviate from God in many ways, right? And so overall, that just means we still have a void and we're unhappy, right? Now society has to pretty much be, there has to be an unequal distribution of wealth, and that's a longer discussion, but I don't want to, this video will just be too long if I explain that. But suffice to say, that has to do with what I was talking about, the superconscious energy node, as it relates to, as it affects our economy, because it's manifested by negative intentions related to greed and avarice, right? So, but suffice it to say, the reality that manifests as a result of that energy node is going to be one that has an unequal distribution of wealth, right? But because there's an unequal distribution of wealth, much of society just exists in a state of impotency, so they just attribute their unhappiness to not being able to follow what society told them was going to make them happy, which is getting lots of money, right? But then other people, and especially one thing that I think has happened today, right? So people who are able to reach this state and actually obtaining things that they believed would make them happy, I think that happens a lot today with a lot of women, actually, right? So in feminism, because that's probably a rare phenomenon in history, right? A lot of women believe, like, I'll be happy if I just have the perfect man and he takes care of me and he makes lots of money, he's 6 foot and looks like a football player and things like that, right? And so I think the advent of I don't know how to say it, right? The invention of dating apps, right, has sort of allowed women, it has increased their negative power, right? It has increased their negative power, and by increasing their reach in terms of the men that's available to them. And what's ended up happening is they've achieved a state of negative potency as it relates to their happiness construct, as it relates to relationships, right? So they believe if a relationship does this or does that, right, and it has these parameters and things like that, then I'll be happy. And what have they found out now that many women have been able to reach this state? And I believe, like I said, I haven't done any research, right? I believe if I've done the research from, I think women generally say they went from the 80s to the 90s to the early 2000s to the 2010s, right? If you look at it and you kind of see when dating apps came along and they became more accepted, because they weren't super accepted, or online dating and things like that, but over time it became more accepted and more sort of central to the way of establishing a relationship, I believe you would see women get more and more and more and more demanding. Now, why do women get more demanding? In other words, now a guy has to be even more something that they would find attractive. They have to make more money. There are some women who say, I'm not going to date anyone unless they're like, not even just a millionaire. That's too small for them now, right? Right? They have to make like maybe 50 million or 100. There's like one chick I know who's practically saying a guy has to be a billionaire, right? They got to be a billionaire. They have to be like, over 6 feet, right? They have to look like a football player, have like 10 cars. And it's like, and it keeps going. Right? And so where does this come from? Well, that's exactly what happens when you're in a state of negative potency. And this is the position women have found themselves in today, which is interesting, right? I think that's an interesting sociological phenomenon, right? Women have found themselves in that position, right? And of course, they're not happy because the true happiness comes from God, right? So what ends up happening is a lot of women have now finally have gotten all the things that they believed was going to make them happy that was very difficult to obtain before. Well, now they've gotten it, right? They developed negative memory to all of it pretty quickly, right? And so then they realize like, I'm not really happy, right? And so it doesn't matter how much money a guy makes, doesn't matter what he looks like, doesn't even matter really how funny he is, right? Although that's probably an important component of it, because the more stimulating or emotionally stimulating guy is, then the more the girl might be able to enter this state, right? Where they, at least now negative memory is not as much of an issue, because the guy keeps emotionally stimulating them, so the woman keeps charging, right? So guys who can get a girl to this state are pretty much okay, right? The girl is still not fully happy, but she might be willing to live with it at least a little bit. This is as happy as you can get, right, with this happiness construct, right? So a lot of girls like bad boy guys, right? So they like those types because they tend to maintain that emotional stimulation, right? Like I said, girls are more positive minded, right? So this is what I believe. Girls are more positive minded. So if they're bored, they just charge you boredom frequency. So they keep needing things to emotionally stimulate them so they're not as bored, right? So they don't charge negative frequencies. A lot of guys don't understand that, right? So like when I used to talk to chicks, right? I used, just not to get into it too long, like when I used to talk to girls, that was actually when I was developing the very earliest aspects of this theory, right? Or the theory of the subconscious, right? So it took years before I got to this stuff, right? But when I was first talking to girls, right, I was trying to learn like how to talk to them. You know, and then long story short, I eventually learned that they needed to be emotionally stimulated. And eventually I learned that if I can I used to kind of talk to girls in very short I don't know what to call it, very short conversations. Right? Because in the effort to try to emotionally stimulate them, it was very horrible. So I actually talked a little bit about that experience in book 1, right? And then eventually I learned. So in book 1, I talked about how when I got in the zone, that was when I was kind of in my zone, right? And my performance level increased like crazy, and I can stimulate the girl much more. But what really was happening, what I learned how to eventually do on a conscious level, is I learned that I had to like engage in almost like storytelling, right? I had to speak to the girl in a way that was almost like a story. Why? Because the subconscious likes its commands in the form of stories. If I want to emotionally stimulate her, that means I want her subconscious to switch to a certain frequency and charge, right? If I want to do that, I got to tell a story. That's how her subconscious likes commands. And I can virtually command it through the reflection principle, right? So we talked about all that in book 1. So eventually I learned how to just continuously speak to her almost in the form or the language of storytelling. I used to kind of try to get a sense of exactly where her subconscious was volatile at. So again, I didn't use those terms back then, right? But if I get on this particular topic and I notice that she kind of starts to move in a transcendental way and she starts to show emotion, things like that, I'm like, okay, her subconscious is volatile there. I'll kind of keep the conversation and my storytelling right in this area because that's where she's going to feel more emotional stimulation, right? So I used to do that stuff like that all the time. But suffice it to say, right, if you can keep emotionally stimulating a girl, she'll be pretty much attracted to you forever. Most guys don't know how to do that, right? So a girl will pretty much end up here. So she can have everything perfect on paper, but just develop negative memory to all of it, and then eventually she's going to be bored again, and she's going to... Now, people solve this problem differently, right? Some people will just look for more shocking situations, and other people, which they can also do both things, they're not mutually exclusive, but other times people will look for new experiences, and that's exactly what you see with women today. A lot of times they'll sleep around, right? So I'm talking about negative feminism. So negative feminism, I think I explained it before. I don't want to make this video too long. Suffice it to say, positive feminism is basically just about rights for women, which is a wonderful thing. Negative feminism is about basically anything that sort of holds women accountable is bad, right? And anything that sort of allows them to experience pleasure or engage in indulgences in a way that doesn't hold them accountable, that's good, right? That's basically it in a nutshell. I could go into more detail with it. That's basically what negative feminism has largely turned into. So a lot of women nowadays, because of this, because they're following this theory of happiness, which comes from materialists, which is wrong, right? They no longer have the luxury, right, of sort of believing in this sort of false theory of happiness, right, which is what I said before. Ignorance is luxury, truth is necessity. Right? So now that they have all these things they thought was going to make them happy and it isn't, right? They're responding to their lack of happiness. So again, and because our society says that there is no morality, there's no God or any of that, right? Morality is whatever we just make up in our heads, right? And negative feminism as a cultural movement has convinced women to engage in your sort of most gross indulgences unapologetically, right? You should be ashamed of having shame. Right, that's the cultural movement of negative feminism. And so a lot of women have listened to that. And so this has resulted in OnlyFans. This has resulted in, adult content and sort of stuff on, I don't use these apps, but like Instagram, I hear stuff like women dress certain ways and put their pictures out there. And ultimately what it has done is caused women to sort of engage in very gross hedonistic behavior, right? And men do the same thing. I'm not just talking about women. Men do it in a different way, right? But it's caused, looking at women for the moment, it's caused them to engage in a lot of hedonistic behavior. And this is where you get these stunts on OnlyFans and sleeping with 1,000 guys and things like that, right? That is the natural result. All of that is hedonism, and ultimately none of that leads to happiness. And where it comes from is not following this guy. It's come from society thinking that it can somehow obtain happiness without following this, right? So we adjusted technology and things like that to increase our pleasure, our ability to experience pleasure, and it has only caused more problems, right? More problems we didn't originally see and things like that, right? Because there's always going to be chaos when you manifest a reality based on frequencies not aligned with the Spirit of God, right? You have intentions that charge frequencies not aligned with the Spirit of God. You're always going to manifest a reality that has all these conditions that are ultimately just chaos, right? That's what always happens. Even like recently, right? So I saw this, at least recently from the time of this video, right? So I saw this article with this girl, this little girl named like Lil Tay, right? I don't know who that is, but apparently she's some online person, and she apparently turned 18 recently as of this video, and she went to OnlyFans, right? Which is crazy. And people are like, oh, this shows our society is so bad and she's such a horrible person. And I'm like, yes, it does show society's bad. But when you say she's a horrible person, the thing you have to understand is that she's a child. I mean, compared to me at my age, right? She's a child, right? I don't consider 18 to really be a full adult, right? You're a kid, right? And I'm like, what did you think was going to happen when you drilled into these children's heads, right? So children in this grow up in this world with these ideas drilled into their head, even more so than probably my generation and older generations, right? It's drilled into their heads, right? That if they don't have all this money, which is negative power, that they're a loser, right? They're not worth much of anything, and they're going to miss out in all the joys and experiences of life, right? And by the way, I should mention that the real joy, true joy and true pleasure and wonderful experiences, they happen in heaven, right? In the way, because I've peeked into heaven, right? So I had a spiritual experience like that, right? I'll talk about that later. The joy and the wonder of heaven is nothing compared to this world. It's like thousands of times, right? Greater than the greatest joy of this world. In the spirit realm, they don't really see the pleasure and joy of this world as like a big deal, because it isn't, right? If you want to experience like true joy and pleasure and have wonderful just experiences that go beyond the imagination, right? That's what heaven's for. You got all eternity to do that, right? So they're not as like on it for what we're meant to do in this life. Like God, the angels, we're meant to serve God in this world. We can, yes, still seek fun, wonderful experiences, but it isn't the priority, right? And we talked about that last video, right? The priority is divine purpose, soul purpose. You can travel and have all these experiences through self-purpose, fine, right? But you don't make these things your idols, right? You don't put them first, right? And that's what we do with hedonistic culture, right? We put these things first. And I'm like, you know, how much society drilled these ideas into her head that you're a loser if you don't have money, you only live once, so you won't have all these amazing experiences. That's your only chance to experience wonder and goodness, right, is in this lifetime, right? And if you don't do that, you're a loser and you miss out on everything and your life is basically not worth anything. So we drilled these ideas into her head. We've also drilled the idea that there's no God, there's no metaphysics. Everything we basically just make up in our head. Life has no meaning, and we go back to the void, or we enter the void of nihilism for all of eternity, right? So we drilled that idea into her head too. So of course she's just going to ignore her morals, right, and do exactly what society told her was important. Like what we always do in society, especially here in America, we always have these sort of cultural values. We sort of champion these cultural values, and then get annoyed or perturbed, right, when we see these sort of sociological fallout for them. What did you think was going to happen, right, from pretending there's no God and just engaging in this hedonistic culture? Of course, that was the natural result, right? So that's basically just to say that's where she gets it from, right? And as a society, we are responsible for the young people in society. They copy us, so they copy the older people, right? How many people do you think she has seen, right, ignore their morals in favor of money? That happens all the time, right, in the upper echelon of society. Of course, celebrities, politicians, adult stars, adult film prostitutes, right? And even like a lot of women in the I don't know who the leaders are in feminism, but I don't think there's enough of them to sort of tell women not to do this, even if you'll make money for it, right? So of course that was a natural result. So we are partially now she's still responsible, yes, but we're as a society we're partially responsible as well for what the young people see and how they behave, right? So they grow up. They don't have as much negative memory as we do as older people, right? So these things are more sort of stimulating to them, right? And so they will seek it more, partially because they're copying us as well. We didn't tell them to focus on discipline, avoid things that tempt you, and focus on God, right? So that's a huge problem with our society, right? And that's what we get from living in a society of hedonism, right? And for men, right, for us, I like to say that dating apps for women, it's like a drug for them, right? It's a drug. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention, right? And I know this video is really long already. I'll try to speed up the second half. But another thing I forgot to mention is that when you obtain negative power, right? Negative power is very tempting to use to solve your happiness problem, right? Because this is also true for dictators, right? Dictators who have all this power and they can pretty much have any sort of worldly treasure they want, they're all unhappy. They all experience the void because they're not living according to the will of God, right? And the thing about negative power is it's tempting to try to solve this problem through your power. But that's what got you there in the first place. Of course, you're not going to be able to solve the problem through the thing that caused it, right? But again, we don't realize that because we pretend there's no metaphysics. We follow the atheist materialist model of reality, right? Which is superstition, right? So they continuously try to solve the problems through their negative power, and it's an endless loop, right? Now, at some point, because God is always reaching out to them, your angels are always reaching out to you, God will put certain things in a person's life to help them to realize this answer, right? That we need God, that we're incomplete without Him, right? And when a person sees certain things, they may feel an inspiration to focus on God. They will have a certain recognition that now they're actually going to have to engage in spiritual work, right? It actually takes work, right, to follow the will of God, to get to know Him, to turn away from sin, to avoid things that tempt you. In other words, negative power is not going to do anything for you, right? It may work in the physical world, right, or in human society, but it does nothing in terms of bringing you close to God. It's completely irrelevant, right? You actually just have to do the spiritual work. And yes, that does involve putting yourself in uncomfortable circumstances, which is positive suffering, right, to serve God. But if you're used to negative power just making everything easy, you can just get any experience you want to using your negative power, which in this case we'll just say is money, right? You may say, I might be able to remove this negative feeling or this feeling of emptiness by, now they don't know about the relationship with God in the way I'm saying, right? But so they'll just say, maybe I can try to turn away from materials, not focus on them so much. In other words, not make them my idol, right? But they recognize by doing that, now they're not putting as much of their manifestational energy into the system. They might lose it, right? They might, it might weaken. They might lose some of their wealth or their power within that system or some of their negative power. And so, they feel uncomfortable, right? But they're giving up all this sort of fake happiness and this fake power for true power and true happiness, which is God. But it's hard to do that, right? Because it's a risk, right? You don't know. Society has drilled into your head that there is no God, right? It's all in our head and we all imagined it, right? Society has drilled into our head that true happiness comes from this very thing that you recognize isn't making you happy. And so a lot of times people will just kind of double down and say, I'm going to find some way to extract happiness from this negative power because it gives them a feeling of safety, right? Because they're working within the human system that uses fake power. So in that fake system, right, they actually have power and control. It gives them a sense of safety, and they want to find a way to get happiness through that system. Again, the conceit. They believe their human intellectuality is sort of superior enough or good enough to somehow find a way to find goodness out of this system. No. So I just wanted to mention that. So a lot of In every society at some point, there are always people who have negative power, and they have to give up their power, their negative power, for the good of society, if that society is going to be more like God, right? Like, so white people, right, had to do that at some point. Now, of course, not all of them do it, but a certain segment of, white people and white, I don't like using that term, right? But a certain section of white people did have to do that, right? And there were cultural movements, right? This kind of, where civil rights came from and things like that. There was a cultural movement, and it wasn't just them, of course, but they supported it, right? And that was necessary, right? And you can say the Civil War, right? There were people who wanted to end slavery, even if that system benefited them. So I'm talking about the white people, right? So every society has people who have negative power in society, they're always going to have to give it up in order for that society to become more idealized, right? And not everyone's able to do it. I believe in modern society, you kind of see that a little bit with women, right? They have a huge amount of negative power in terms of relationships, and they just don't want to give that up, right? But we're recognizing as a society now that that's created problems, right? And it's creating an issue where women have sort of too much negative power in the form of relationships, and it's creating a kind of bifurcation in terms of the dating lifestyle between women and men and things like that. And it's creating all types of sociological problems which people are recognizing, right? And to go to men, for men, so what the reason I was saying all of that was to say that for women, dating apps is like a drug. It's like their drug, and it's causing them to constantly give into temptation of using that negative power, right? And if they don't use that negative power, then they now have to play on the level playing field of God's kingdom, where they engage with positive power, or they obtain positive power through the Holy Spirit. But now you actually have to do some type of work, right? You can't just, use your sexuality to sort of get a kind of advantage like you can in the fake system, that fake human system we created, right? So it's tempting to not go that route, right? So a lot of women have trouble giving up that negative power, and they'll just endlessly stay in the happiness carousel trying to find happiness, through relationships. Some of them do it until they're like in their 70s, right? That's called that's way past what they call the wall. But that, this is stuff they talk about in the red pill community, right? But for us men, our drug has been adult titles, right? So that cuts our manifestational ability in half, right? Because it completely ruins our subconscious charge. It causes God's Spirit to recede from our life, because that's sinful. It is lust, right? And even then, our body changes, and it affects our subconscious in a way that prevents our subconscious from charging properly. So now we can't manifest the reality we want, right? So it completely ruins men, right? In what has happened since we've had more of these adult titles, right? We've wanted more attractive women, more I wouldn't say in this video, but we wanted more attractive women overall, more and more and more, right? And that ended up leading to women now having a desire to be more attractive because they see that's what men want, right? And it's created this value system that's ruined it for everybody, right? So that has been our drug, right? And now you see, like even today, like I see so many like young people, like they all work out, right? Like they're all like muscular, right? But I understand why they do it, right? There's nothing bad with working out. You just don't want it to be your idol, right? You don't want to put more of your manifestational energy into that than God, right? But I understand why they do it, because that's what women want, right? Women have become extraordinarily selective, right? But here's the problem with this. This is a problem I see. If you have all these people operating according to this sort of highly selfish or self-centered or self-focused intention, right? You're putting all this manifestational energy into it. What type of reality is going to manifest from that, right? You cannot separate the frequency of selfishness from a person's intention and what they're going to manifest. Of course, you're going to manifest something that doesn't have God's Spirit in it, right? And there are going to be all these reality conditions you didn't account for. And there's going to be new things you didn't account for in these realities that manifest globally that are just going to create new problems, right? And so ultimately, I say all that to just say that having this hedonistic culture, which by the way is kind of what Satanism says, right? To just focus on indulge in the most amount of pleasures possible, not caring about anyone. That is Satanism. And that's kind of a subset of what hedonistic culture is, right? Focusing on having a culture that's based on this is always going to lead to negative outcomes, and this is exactly what we see, right? In fact, another component of that This is crazy, right? It's crazy that this even exists, but something called mukbang content. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but it's when people just eat online. They eat endlessly, right? And because we believe that we just make up things in our heads, value systems in our heads, right? And we just make up sort of prescriptions randomly about what makes a perfect society, right? You actually see a movement where people have, a movement where people say, oh, it's called basically fat positivity, right? They say it's okay to be fat and it's not a bad thing and, it's good. They make it seem like it's somehow debatable, right? Like that is not just a biological truth, right? And so what they do is they engage in gluttony, the sin of gluttony, right? And I'm not saying all of them. I'm talking about people who engage in this mukbang content, right? They'll engage in gluttony, they'll just eat all day, gain all types of weight, right? Do it because they think people like it and they make money off of it and things like that. So now it's their idol, right? It's become their idol. And many of them have actually died doing this, right? Like I said, you can only get away with ignoring the truth for so long. If you can do it, then it's considered a luxury. But sooner or later, the truth will basically come for the bill, right? And so you're going to have to pay up. In other words, eventually the reality will sort of force you to recognize the truth, right? And so they realize, like, no, it's not debatable. Gaining, being obese like that is bad, right? Of course. But we've gotten used to this sort of adjusting our beliefs randomly because we believe in material superstition. All of life is meaningless, right? And we've sort of adapted that to have this culture of hedonism, right? So not good, And I can go on and on and on, right? But I think I kind of made the point. There's so many other things I could talk about with that. But to go to this next point, it says, the ideal government can never be reached without God, right? So that's important too, because so what we generally do also in society is we want, a lot of times we keep thinking, and this is very big in the political community, right? We look at all the problems in our society and all the issues, and I can make a very long list of them: education, the drug problem, the issue with like mass shootings and the economy, and so on and so forth. And we look at these issues and we say, well, if we could pass a bill or we could pass a law, we would solve these problems. No, right? Because this is how I see it. You're only going to get so far through laws. Laws are useful to a degree. Of course, it is a very important degree, right? I don't say that to make it sound trivial, right? But if you want to evolve to a certain point, then laws are only going to take you so far, right? How many laws did we sort of pass in the past, right, related to corruption in what they call antitrust laws and things like that in corruption in politics that we just eventually got rid of, right? Someone just, gave money or bribed some politician or some judge, right? They did that over decades and decades, and then the laws got looser and looser, and boom, we were back to where we started, right? Just because you have a law, it doesn't mean anything, right? I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything, but it is not, it doesn't sustain a perfect society, by any means, right? There's this girl, right? This is political chick, who I actually got a crush on her. I don't like her. But anyway, right? So this girl named Briahna Joy Gray, she has this very academic energy to her. I love that sort of air about her. But anyway, right? So her name is Briahna Joy Gray, right? So I remember she was having a debate with someone. I forget who it was. It might have been a guy named Walsh, but she was basically saying she believes in a third party. Right? She believes in because the Democratic Party is corrupt and the Republican Party is corrupt, which is correct, right? But she believes in I think starting a new party. And I'm like, that's good, right? You can try that, no problem. But I'm like, what's to stop them from just becoming corrupted as well, right? So just because the powers that in society don't corrupt those smaller parties now, they don't do it because they're too small. But as soon as they grow, give it 30 years, they'll just keep bribing politicians to infiltrate that party, and then they'll be like the Democratic Party, and you'll be back where you started, right? So in other words, I like to think of politics as almost like a game of front hand, back hand, right? Where there's this it's this skit from Key and Peele. So I won't go into it now, but if you see the skit, you know what I'm talking about, right? Trying to vote for like the right political party to make a difference in the world, it's almost like a game of front hand, backhand, right? One party is the front hand, the other party is the backhand, right? And it's like the same thing as in the skit, right? You keep thinking that maybe there's some trick. You think there's some way to solve the game or win the game. There isn't, right? When you pick one party and they're not as good as you thought, you think, oh, the answer was the other party. That's why. And when you pick for the other party and they're worse than you thought, you think about it for a while and you're like, oh, no, I can win now, right? I'll win this way, right? Which is exactly what he did in the skit. And it's like, no, right? It'll only take you so far. What really leads to a truly good society, right? Even before God, is just culture, right? And there are many societies that I would argue have reached higher states of happiness than America, than us. And they aren't necessarily even super, at least what we would call religious, right? Which I think religious is just like a human thing, right? It's not actually, doesn't actually have spiritual meaning, at least metaphysically, right? So like Japan, I think, is one. What's another one? Not Norway, Swiss. One of those countries in that region. I forget what they're called, but yeah. So a lot of these countries. I don't think they're super religious, but they have a much higher state of happiness. Why? Because they're going more in tune with their intuition or spiritual drive, right? It doesn't matter what they call God on a conscious level, right? If they're going more in alignment with that intuition and spiritual drive, they are behaving in a way that is closer to how God calls us to behave, or is closer to behaving in the likeness of Jesus Christ, right? So there's not a lot of crime, right? There is a sense of discipline, not overeating, like, in our country, unfortunately, right? There's a lot of overeating, right? Because that's a part of hedonistic lifestyle. In these other countries, people are thin because they exercise discipline, right? They practice avoiding temptation, which is engaging in the likeness of Jesus Christ. So this leads to greater sociological outcomes. In other words, their culture allows them to be more happy. Now you don't need all these crazy laws because people generally don't want to commit a crime anyway, right? But ultimately, even that's only going to take you so far, right? Eventually, you are going to need to have a strong relationship with Jesus, right? And you will need to be led by the Holy Spirit to have the greatest society, right? So I just say that to say that the government will, we try to change the government and, we try to make a difference. Please, it's only going to take you so far, right? And even still, the Holy Spirit can move inside the government as well, right? People think that, and I think I might have mentioned this before, but people think that, God is some distant figure who doesn't talk to us, and he won't help us in these impossible moral conundrums, right? So we experience moral conundrums, and God doesn't help us because he doesn't want to get his hands dirty, but he'll judge us, if we're not perfect, we're less than perfect. No, right? All of these government officials who are dealing with these impossible sort of conditions in society and these possible problems for the government to solve, God will help all of them, right? And he can help them solve these problems and use his intelligence, which is infinite, right, to help us to solve these problems and create a perfect society, create perfect laws, and things like that, right? But God's Spirit, the government's no different than our lives, right? God's Spirit will move in our life and he'll direct us when we want him to, when we express consent. And one of the main ways we express consent is by repenting, praying to God, asking him to come into our life, and having a regular pattern of intention that says we love God and we want to serve him, right? If you had a government full of people doing that, boom, problem solved. Now God can work inside that government. The Holy Spirit can help that government create laws and things like that, right? But most of our government is full of liars, right? You almost can't get to government without being basically a pathological, almost psychopathic liar, right? Not all of them are necessarily, I would describe as psychopathic, but it's kind of hard to say. A lot of them are, though, right? And so these people who lie for a living, that's a sin, right? They will not, I don't believe they're going to inherit the kingdom of God. I don't like to make absolute statements like that because that's God's decision. But a lot of these people they are regular liars, right? I believe, so I talked about how spiritual drive recedes, right? When you continuously engage in sin, and when your spiritual energy drops to a certain degree, your spiritual energy kicks into overdrive, and if you continue to sin, then it kind of recedes. I believe some of them have lied so much they've reached that state, which is why they're kind of so psychopaths, right, in our government, like the senators and congressmen and things like that, right? But ultimately, because our Congress is filled with people like that in the presidency, then God's spirit is not able to sort of influence or move within this government as much. Now it's just a sort of human creation. In fact, a lot of demonic entities move inside this government, which we'll talk about that in a moment, right? And so that doesn't create the greatest society possible. So this is just another example of sort of looking at sociology metaphysically, right? And so to go into this case, this has to do with the spiritual case and self-help community. So it says New Age / self-help often leads to emptiness and depression. So in other words, basically in this case is a little bit different, right? Because most of the other examples I talked about came from, the modern theory of happiness, which mostly comes from atheists, right, or materialists, and they're mostly just lazy, right, when it comes to spirituality. But not everybody's lazy when it comes to spirituality, right? So in the New Age, they are seeking God. Well, not God, but they're seeking something more, right? And that's what their spiritual drive sort of directs them to do. The problem, and we're going to talk a little more about this in the next video, right? The problem is that they're not seeking God, right? So they'll seek spirit guides, or they'll seek the higher self, or they'll seek aliens. A lot of them like to do that. They'll engage in mediumship or seek, familiar spirits or ancestors or whatever, right? And they seek these things, in an effort to experience true happiness. Now it doesn't work, right? Because they're not actually following the will of God, so they still notice the void. Nothing changed. And that's what I was mentioning earlier. For us born-again Christians, we experience true happiness. You could practically torture us and we would still be happy, right? And I shouldn't really say it like that, but I'm just saying, right? Because we recognize that happiness is not a function of material things. We recognize that suffering is a part of life, right? Like Buddha said the same thing. Following God doesn't mean you'll never suffer. That's what the atheists think. Oh, how could he have God in his life if he suffered, right? If he scratched his, pinky or something, then that means God doesn't exist or something. No, right? If you follow the will of God, we'll actually talk a little more about that idea in the next video as well. But yeah, like me as a follower of Jesus Christ, for all I know, one day I could suffer and, be tortured for years or whatever, right? These things happen, right, for a reason. There's always a reason for all forms of suffering, right? It's never in vain. Well, positive suffering is negative in vain. Negative suffering can be in vain, right, because that comes from us. But if God allows these things, we trust in God's will and we endure it to the best of our ability, but we still endure it while focusing on Jesus, right? And so ultimately, a born-again Christian, nothing can take away their happiness, right? Not only them. If they no longer have faith in Jesus Christ, that's the only thing that takes it away, right? And so when we feel the closing of that void in our relationship with Jesus, right, we recognize that nothing else could do that except Jesus Christ. Now, people in New Age, because they don't have a relationship with Jesus, they'll do all these stuff that might look in some ways similar to people who focus on Jesus, but they'll notice the void didn't go away, right? That's the giveaway, right? They still feel empty. And you hear this all the time. And people engage in New Age and witchcraft and, self-help with Reiki and crystals and all this crap, right? And astral projection. You notice that they always feel so empty. They feel depressed. They feel like they have no purpose or no meaning because they're not following the will of God, right? You may follow things that claim to be God in according to what you thought looked like God, but the void doesn't go away, and that's the giveaway, right? Same thing in the self-help community, right? So in self-help community, they'll teach people, you can basically solve all of your problems, right? Your intelligence is grand enough and you're wise enough to solve all your problems, and you're potent enough to solve all your problems, right? And often, I shouldn't say all your problems, but often a component of that is going to therapy, right? So just go to some other person. I cannot tell you how much I hate those stupid BetterHelp commercials, right? And I believe they're extremely manipulative. I know how subconscious works and how subliminal messaging works, right? You talked a little bit about it before. So it'd be too much to go into here, but I know how all that stuff works. I'm telling you, those commercials use a huge amount of subliminal messaging to guys, right? But what they do is they try to convince people that, another person, right? So, which is also part of self-help. You help yourself by asking for help from another person and basically just talking to them about your problems. And they prescribe a set of behaviors to you. Like, if they're not prescribing God, right, then I argue that a lot of people are not going to be helped by their sessions, or barely helped, which is exactly what I believe. And I haven't looked at it. I hear it enough times, but I haven't looked at any kind of bulk dating report for it. But I've heard it lots of times where people say, oh yeah, that didn't help at all, right? Like, exactly, right? Now, is there a place for therapy? Of course there is. God could lead you to a therapist, right? But it has a place. Therapy cannot replace the impact God is supposed to have in your life, right? So if these therapists aren't telling people to develop a relationship with God, like, how could you possibly help them? It's nonsense, right? And that's what I mentioned in chapter 5, right? But that comes from practicing material superstition. It would be like someone coming to me with like an infection and I get like my eye of newts to like solve their problems, right? So that's supernatural superstition, right? Obviously that wouldn't make any sense. That's the witch doctor, right? That's the type of doctor existed in like the Middle Ages. So now we have medical science and medical technology. We have a robust education based on materialism, and that's a good thing. But there's a metaphysical flip side to that, right? There's a type of happiness, or you can be sick metaphysically, right? Or in a way that's due to metaphysical principles, or have a disease, which I didn't make a video about this in this sort of curriculum. I'll probably talk about that after the curriculum is over, like in just other videos. But suffice it to say, right, you can have problems mentally, right, like the feeling of the void, being unhappy, being depressed. These can all be problems from metaphysical phenomena, right? And all of it really starts from the fact that in some way you weren't following the will of God, right? Now, will these BetterHelp therapists or whoever say this? Of course not, right? They would be heresy, right? It would be malpractice, I should say, to prescribe God to someone, right? And so now these people aren't ever really going to be helped because you're practicing you're doing the eye of newt witch doctor version of metaphysical science, right? And so it's horrible. So that leads to all types of depression and problems in society, and people go deeper into New Age looking to solve this problem, so it becomes a kind of vicious loop. And that's another just problem overall that comes from our society, from people not applying the law of happiness, right? So the last thing, right, and any video is finally over. This video is a lot longer than I kind of was planning for it to be. But the last thing is this point. It says without God, humanity is much more vulnerable to negative entities. So this is another thing that we don't acknowledge in our culture, right? We don't acknowledge in science, right? I was going to say metaphysical science, but just science in general, right? Is that we think, we're told there's no such thing as demons. It's in our head. People have experiences with them every day, all the time, but they all imagined it, right? So it didn't really happen, right? It was just in your head, right? You imagined it, right? And these entities don't really have the impact on your life, right? They're just part of your imagination. If you just stop imagining them, right, then, your life will be happy, right? And that's complete nonsense, right? And I know they'll say, oh no, it's some, hallucination that they can't control in their brain. And, they'll rationalize it by saying things like that. But ultimately, no. Negative entities are real, right? They love that we think they're not real, right? Because it makes their job way easier, right? And they impact the most corrupt, the most impactful aspects of our society, which is the government, right? Used to be celebrity culture. More people are waking up to that, right? Are the most corrupted because demonic entities are most focused on those aspects of society because they can sort of create the most amount of corruption and negative energy throughout society. They can corrupt us and cause us to make decisions that produce negative energy, which they feed off of, right? And it creates a society that when we produce tensions and alignment with demonic entities, we can only manifest a reality that has less of God's spirit in it, right? It has less of his qualities, and it's just going to be more chaos, more corruption, more pain, more everything bad, right? And so this is like the opposite of this. So it's not just that you can't create the greatest society possible by not being directed by the Holy Spirit. It's also that you will ignore, if you follow material superstition, right, you ignore the impact of negative entities, right? It's like believing your body can't have a disease from like pathogens, right? If something goes wrong, right, it's just because your body failed in some way. There's no such thing as bacteria, viruses, parasites, things like that. Nonsense. Of course, you need to create a better medical system, a system that's better able to help people medically, right? You want to recognize that there's bacteria, pathogens, and things like that, right? And you want to learn how to solve them, right? And so not believing in God increases these guys' ability and puts more strain on our system, on our society, and causes it ultimately to sort of move more toward a system that's less in the likeness of God, so long as we continue to make decisions not in alignment with the Spirit of God, right? Now, there are people in our society people, like I said, because we still have spiritual drive, we all still have angels, and God still moves in all of our lives, things like that. We produce intentions with somewhat regularity, right, or some degree of regularity, where we don't, as a society, don't go so deep, right, into a kind of antichrist sort of a society that reflects the nature of an antichrist way of thinking, but we're still not going far. So in other words, it's exactly like I said with the carousel, right? Sometimes we go further this way, sometimes we go a little further up. Some societies may be a little further along, some societies are less far along, but ultimately, right, we're not going to have the highest society possible, and some moments in history we will be succumb more to the pressure of negative entities, in which case we're not listening to the Spirit of God in those cases, and we get a worse off society. Right, so that's just going to keep happening until the end of time, right? This kind of back and forth between a slightly more positive society, slightly less positive, slightly more positive, less positive, right? Sometimes we listen to demonic entities more, sometimes we listen to God more, but ultimately, we're never going to have the most ideal society where everyone's happy, right? And it's basically heaven on earth, right? We're not going to obtain that unless we all have a strong relationship with Jesus Christ and we listen, or we're directed by the Holy Spirit, right? So I think one last thing I want to mention, then this will finally be done, is I think I mentioned it before, that if you just believe in God, I believe you'll get some authority in terms of your manifestation, and God will still direct you in terms of your life. But specifically when you believe in Jesus, and you know God is Jesus Christ, and you have a strong relationship with Him, now you get the most authority. So that's kind of the hierarchy of manifestational authority in the spirit realm. Right, and that's basically confirmed by all types of people who used to be witches and Satanists and things like that. They all say the same thing, that Christians have the most power out of everybody, right? And that's because we get additional power through the authority of Jesus Christ and through the Holy Spirit. Our will is allowed to manifest much more easily than everyone else's. It just pushes theirs back, right? And our will manifests because our will is more aligned with the will of God, right? And so that's why I say, to create the most perfect society, we all need to have a strong relationship with Jesus. It always goes back to Jesus Christ, right? And through Him, right, if you can imagine the whole world, right, had a strong relationship with Jesus, we could all be directed by the Holy Spirit, right? And then we'd have the most perfect reality possible, right? So that's a metaphysical law, right? I argue, like I said, you can almost create the concept of metaphysical sociology, and I argue if you look through all the history, right? So this was just a piece of it. I believe there are many different things you could look at. There are many things I didn't talk about, right? That you can kind of break it down and understand it more, looking at the nature of the subconscious, right? And sort of applying it to this law of happiness. And I believe the data that you'll see pretty much fits perfectly with what you would expect as predicted by this theory. So yeah, that's it, finally. In the next video, we're going to discuss the metaphysical law of knowing. Right, and in that case, we're now going to look at kind of how to deal with the problem of information being so relative in the spirit realm, right, and how we kind of go about getting true knowledge or absolute knowledge. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.